to the WNBA Draft 2026 presented by State Street Investment Management SPY. Welcome again, everyone. Introduce Commissioner.
The golden era of professional women's basketball was supposed to be a massive unified celebration. A long overdue moment when shattered television records and sold-out arenas finally put the sport on the global map forever. But behind closed doors at the league headquarters, an absolute civil war was brewing that threatened to tear the entire organization apart from the inside out. Millions of new eager fans tuned in every single night to watch Caitlin Clark completely revolutionize the game from the perimeter, completely unaware of the highly toxic power struggle happening in the shadows of the front office. Rumors began circulating of intense boardroom screaming matches, secret executive meetings, and a leadership meltdown so incredibly severe that it almost resulted in the unthinkable. Whispers leaked out through industry insiders that the commissioner's office was actively considering unprecedented disciplinary actions, essentially plotting to implement secret suspension protocols to silence the very player who was keeping the stadium lights on. It wasn't just about the game of basketball anymore. It was about massive egos, institutional control, and a desperate, frantic scramble to manage a media circus that had completely spiraled out of the league's hands. To fully comprehend how the organization arrived at the absolute brink of a catastrophic public relations scandal, we have to look back at the exact moment the league lost control of its own carefully crafted narrative. The brutal, highly publicized in-court beatdowns that went viral on social media were just a convenient cover for a much deeper, darker boardroom conspiracy that involved the highest levels of management. From the very first moment she stepped onto the professional hardwood, it was painfully obvious to everyone watching that the sensational rookie was operating with a massive invisible target painted squarely on her back. We all saw the endless viral clips of questionable cheap shots, the unexpected blindside hits, and the relentless physical intimidation that went far beyond the boundaries of normal competitive basketball. Hardened veterans of the league, who had spent decades grinding in relative obscurity for minimal paychecks, felt deeply disrespected by the unprecedented astronomical media attention she was instantly receiving. They made absolutely sure she felt their brewing frustration every single time she dared to drive to the basket or set a screen, turning standard regular season matchups into highly aggressive physical spectacles. Yet, while the newly minted fans were screaming from the bleachers for immediate technical fouls, flagrant reviews, and player ejections, the highly paid executives running the league were deafeningly, suspiciously silent. It was almost as if a clandestine, unspoken memo had been quietly passed around the locker rooms, subtly allowing the most popular female athlete on the planet to be used as a nightly punching bag to drive up engagement metrics. The referees inexplicably swallowed their whistles on blatant fouls, and the front office conveniently looked the other way, secretly hoping the escalating drama would just magically translate into even higher television ratings and lucrative sponsorship deals. But playing dangerous, calculated games with your most valuable financial asset usually backfires in spectacular fashion, and the simmering situation was about to blow up in their faces. Just when everyone in the sports media landscape thought the league's top brass couldn't possibly mishandle the mounting tension any worse, the commissioner opened her mouth and made the single biggest, most catastrophic mistake of her professional career. When WNBA Commissioner Kathy Angelbert went on national television for a highly anticipated financial interview, she was handed the absolute perfect opportunity to calm the turbulent waters and firmly stand up for basic player safety. Instead of taking the high road, she delivered a stunning masterclass in corporate dodging that left analysts, players, and fans completely speechless. When directly pressed by the interviewers about the deeply toxic online narratives and the obvious physical targeting of her rookie star, she deliberately chose not to condemn the dangerous behavior or promise tighter officiating standards. In a move that shocked the sports world, she nonchalantly compared the rapidly escalating tensions to a traditional corporate marketing rivalry, treating the genuine physical risks and mental exhaustion her players were enduring like a harmless scripted storyline designed solely to sell more sneakers and merchandise. The public backlash to this tone-deaf television appearance was absolutely instantaneous and completely devastating to her credibility. The official players' union, completely furious that the head of the league was perfectly fine with leveraging deeply toxic fan behavior and physical risk for a quick financial buck, released a scathing, unprecedented public statement. They demanded accountability, essentially accusing the commissioner of abandoning her duty to protect the women who actually play the game. Angelbert suddenly found herself completely isolated on an island, desperately trying to backtrack and issue clarifying statements as the sports media completely ripped her leadership capabilities apart on live television. But what looked to the general public like a simple, albeit massive public relations disaster was actually the hidden catalyst for the most twisted, calculated coaching takeover in modern basketball history. While the embattled commissioner was furiously fighting to save her job in the corporate boardroom, a completely different, highly strategic mastermind was actively dismantling the rookie star on the court. Stephanie White, the universally respected and fiercely competitive head coach of the Connecticut Sun, knew exactly how to ruthlessly exploit the ongoing chaos to her team's advantage. When the high-stakes playoffs finally arrived, White masterfully orchestrated a complex defensive scheme that was borderline ruthless, specifically designed to physically exhaust, trap, and completely frustrate the young Indiana star. The resulting playoff series was incredibly tense, aggressive, and suffocating, culminating in a highly controversial viral moment when Clark took a brutal, uncalled shot directly to the eye during a crucial possession. The arena erupted and fans across the internet were absolutely furious, loudly accusing White's veteran squad of completely crossing the line from tough playoff-level defense into outright unacceptable dirty play. But Stephanie White didn't care at all about the outside noise, the social media trolls, or the desperate pleas from the opposing fans. She was entirely focused on winning basketball games and proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that she was the absolute brightest tactical mind in the entire league. She openly, coldly dismissed the surrounding media frenzy during her post-game press conferences, focusing purely on her veteran roster's execution and their relentless push for a championship ring. However, there was a massive, completely unexpected twist hiding right beneath the surface of this intense, nationally televised rivalry. The brilliant woman who was coldly orchestrating the painful playoff downfall of the Indiana Fever was actually secretly plotting a master plan to take the keys to their entire billion-dollar franchise. The off-season hit the basketball world like an absolute freight train, and the sports rumor mill immediately went into overdrive when the Indiana Fever abruptly shockingly fired their head coach Christy Sides. Despite successfully guiding the young, developing team into the playoffs and dealing with an unprecedented media circus, the franchise's front office silently knew they needed a much stronger, more commanding, and far more strategic voice. They needed someone who could effectively protect their generational franchise player from the physical abuse of the league while simultaneously handling the overwhelming, crushing weight of the global media spotlight. Almost immediately after the firing was announced, Stephanie White's name surfaced across multiple reports as the primary undisputed target for the vacant position. It was a completely shocking, almost unbelievable development to the casual observer. The very same aggressive coach who had just meticulously orchestrated the brutal physical dismantling of Clark on national television was now being heavily courted to be her ultimate mentor, tactical guide, and organizational protector. Behind the closed doors of the franchise, the contract negotiations were reportedly incredibly intense, with White allegedly demanding total unquestioned control over the team's roster, the offensive system, and a rock-solid guarantee that the front office would fiercely back her up against any potential league interference. She was highly intelligent, and she knew exactly what she was walking into. Taking the Indiana job meant willingly stepping into the absolute center of a massive uncontrollable media hurricane. And she absolutely wasn't going to do it without absolute dictatorial authority over her locker room. But the terrifying thought of a ruthless strategist like Stephanie White officially teaming up with the league's biggest, most lucrative star sent absolute, undeniable panic straight through the commissioner's office in New York. The league executives knew that if White was given the keys to the Fever, she would build an impenetrable fortress around Clark, completely changing the power dynamic of the entire sport. And that is exactly when the dark, unsettling whispers of a secret, highly controversial suspension protocol started heavily leaking out of league headquarters. According to explosive, deeply sourced industry rumors, the commissioner was completely terrified of the overall power dynamic drastically shifting away from the centralized league office and directly into the hands of the Indiana franchise. If Stephanie White took over the team and successfully unleashed a highly protected, fully weaponized, and strategically optimized version of Clark, the entire WNBA front office would essentially be at their mercy when it came to scheduling, media access, and narrative control. Speculation began to run completely wild that during heated, highly classified backdoor meetings, Angelbert's desperate office floated the terrifying idea of strictly enforcing a brand new, highly controversial behavioral and toxicity policy. The alleged deeply guarded plan was to openly threaten severe suspensions, hefty fines, or mandatory benching protocols for any player or coach who actively escalated the media toxicity or complained about the officiating. It was widely viewed by insiders as a thinly veiled, incredibly aggressive attempt to force the ascending Indiana Fever franchise firmly back into line before they became too powerful to manage. Some well-connected insiders even suggested that the league secretly considered mandating a temporary benching or a cooling-off suspension specifically targeted at the biggest stars if the intense drama between White's new aggressive play style and the disgruntled opposing teams got completely out of hand. It was a deeply desperate, frantic, and grasping attempt by a heavily criticized commissioner who was rapidly losing her grip on reality, trying to forcefully remind everyone in the ecosystem who was actually supposedly in charge of the sport. The sheer unadulterated audacity of even theoretical threatening to sideline the single biggest financial draw in women's sports history over an internal corporate power struggle is completely utterly mind-blowing. But attempting to forcibly silence the most famous female athlete in the entire world wasn't going to be anywhere near that easy. And the resulting financial and public backlash would have been absolutely catastrophic for the league's bottom line. When word of these alleged draconian ultimatums and secret suspension protocols finally reached the Indiana Fever's front office, all hell absolutely broke loose behind the scenes. You simply do not threaten to suspend or financially handicap the ultimate golden goose of the sports world without expecting a massive scorched earth corporate war. And Stephanie White is definitively not the kind of coach who ever backs down from a highly publicized fight. Reports heavily suggest that the immediate pushback from the Indiana franchise against the league office was incredibly swift, deeply aggressive, and entirely uncompromising. The franchise ownership essentially dared the embattled commissioner to actually try and formally intervene, knowing full well that powerful television networks, massive corporate sponsors, and millions of dedicated fans would absolutely riot in the streets if their favorite star was benched over petty internal league politics and fragile executive egos. Angelbert quickly and painfully realized she had completely overplayed her hand in a massive, potentially career-ending way. She was hopelessly trapped between desperately trying to assert traditional authority over a league that was growing entirely too fast for her to effectively control and painfully bowing down to the undeniable, frustrating reality that the prominent players and elite coaches now held absolutely all of the financial leverage. The heavily rumored suspension threats and toxicity protocols quietly, swiftly vanished into the ether, hurriedly replaced by carefully worded, overly positive press releases and fake forced smiles for the eager television cameras. The executives tried to sweep the entire explosive ordeal under the rug, pretending that the league was one big happy family moving forward into a lucrative new television deal. But the damage was already permanently done. The absolute trust was completely shattered and the battle lines for the future of the sport had been officially drawn in the sand. Which ultimately brings us to the most important pressing question of who is really pulling the strings in this rapidly expanding billion-dollar sporting empire. The undeniable objective truth of the matter is that the delicate balance of power in professional women's basketball has permanently irreversibly shifted. And the wealthy executives sitting in their luxury suites are completely, utterly terrified of this brand new reality. They spent multiple decades begging and pleading for the mainstream sports world to finally pay attention to their product. But now that the global spotlight is blindingly bright and completely unforgiving, they clearly have absolutely no idea how to effectively manage the intense heat. Caitlin Clark didn't just change the physical way the game of basketball is played on the court. She completely inadvertently exposed the massive structural flaws in exactly how the entire professional league is managed from the top down by ruthlessly forcing the issue, refusing to back down from physical intimidation and bringing in a proven fearless powerhouse like Stephanie White to run the locker room. The Indiana franchise essentially staged a brilliant silent corporate coup. They decisively proved to the entire sports world that they are the ones who officially dictate the terms, control the massive viewership numbers, and drive the financial revenue now, not the severely weakened commissioner's office. As the highly anticipated new season rapidly approaches, absolutely all eyes will be intensely watching every single questionable foul, every tense post-game press conference, and every single subtle passive-aggressive interaction between the Indiana bench and the league's front office. The Wnba might have barely survived this chaotic, highly destructive internal corporate war, but the immense boiling tension is still heavily simmering just below the surface, eagerly waiting for the absolute slightest spark to ignite the entire powder keg all over again. The very next time the desperate league executives attempt to flex their diminishing administrative muscles and forcibly control the organic narrative, they might just quickly find out that the beautiful game has completely, permanently left them behind in the dust. Keep paying very close, undivided attention to the sidelines and the hushed conversations during the timeouts because the real high-stakes battles are no longer just being fought on the shiny hardwood courts. They are being ruthlessly fought in the dark shadows of the boardroom. The financial stakes have absolutely never been higher. And the true fight for the soul of the league is just beginning. The terrifying reality for the rest of the league was that the Indiana Fever suddenly looked less like a rebuilding basketball franchise and far more like a fully operational media empire with a team attached to it. Every single move they made generated national headlines. Every pregame tunnel walk became viral social media content within minutes. Every press conference was dissected frame by sports analysts, podcast hosts, former players, and even mainstream political commentators who previously never paid attention to women's basketball at all. The game itself was evolving into something much larger than sports entertainment, and nobody inside league headquarters seemed prepared for how quickly the power structure was shifting beneath their feet. Inside the Fever organization, Stephanie White reportedly wasted absolutely no time establishing a completely different tone around the locker room. Team practices became noticeably more intense, more disciplined, and far more confrontational. Veteran players who were comfortable with mediocrity suddenly found themselves being challenged on every defensive rotation, every transition assignment, and every lazy possession during film sessions. White understood something the rest of the league was still struggling to comprehend. Talent alone was not enough anymore. The Indiana Fever were no longer simply trying to qualify for the playoffs. They were attempting to become the defining sports dynasty of an entirely new era. And at the center of that entire transformation stood Caitlin Clark. The media pressure surrounding Clark had already reached levels previously reserved only for global superstars in men's sports. But White allegedly believed the young phenom had only scratched the surface of what she could become if the organization fully committed to building a fortress around her development. Sources close to the franchise began quietly leaking stories about expanded performance staffs, upgraded security measures at road games, specialized recovery programs, and carefully controlled media access designed to shield the star guard from the non-stop chaos surrounding her every movement. That sudden organizational shift sent shockwaves throughout the rest of the WNBA. Opposing coaches privately worried that Indiana was about to create a competitive advantage the rest of the league simply could not financially match. Smaller market franchises were already struggling to keep pace with the explosion in national attention. Arena upgrades, charter travel demands, sponsorship negotiations, and player salary expectations were all rapidly accelerating at a pace that made some ownership groups deeply uncomfortable. The Fever, however, appeared completely prepared to spend aggressively in pursuit of total dominance. That growing divide created an undercurrent of resentment that became impossible to ignore. Some veteran stars around the league reportedly felt that the entire ecosystem was beginning to revolve around a single player and a single franchise. Television scheduling heavily favored Indiana. National broadcasts consistently centered their storylines around Clark's performances. Merchandise sales from the Fever dramatically outpaced almost every other team combined. Even casual sports fans who barely understood the league standings knew exactly when Indiana was playing. For older players who had spent years fighting for respect with minimal recognition, the imbalance became emotionally exhausting. Publicly, most athletes maintained professionalism. They praised the increased visibility. They celebrated sold-out arenas and rising salaries. But privately, frustration continued boiling beneath the surface. Some believed the league office had effectively abandoned any attempt to maintain competitive neutrality. Others feared that referees were now under enormous pressure from every direction, terrified of making calls that could influence nationally televised Clark games and trigger another massive social media controversy. The officiating discourse became especially toxic. Every hard foul involving Indiana instantly exploded online. Every missed whistle became a viral debate. Slow-motion clips flooded social platforms within seconds of controversial plays occurring. Referees found themselves under an unprecedented microscope, with fans accusing them of either unfairly targeting Clark or excessively protecting her depending entirely on which side of the argument they already supported. The pressure became so overwhelming that several league officials reportedly requested additional security during certain playoff environments. That is when league executives allegedly realized the situation had evolved far beyond normal sports controversy. This was now a full-scale battle over the identity of the modern WNBA. One side envisioned a carefully controlled corporate product where the league office dictated narratives, protected partnerships, and maintained centralized authority over player branding. The other side increasingly believed that the athletes themselves were now the true engines driving the business forward and therefore deserved dramatically greater influence over how the sport operated. Stephanie White quietly emerged as one of the most important figures in that entire philosophical war. Unlike many coaches who avoided conflict with league executives, White had developed a reputation for being fearless in high-pressure environments. She understood media manipulation. she understood power dynamics. Most importantly, she understood how to weaponize public momentum. Her arrival in Indiana was viewed by many insiders as the equivalent of hiring a hardened political strategist during a national crisis. Almost immediately, subtle changes in messaging became noticeable. Post-game interviews from the Fever grew more calculated. Players sounded increasingly unified in their responses regarding officiating and league treatment. The organization projected confidence bordering on defiance. Even their social media presence became sharper and more aggressive, leaning heavily into themes of resilience, disrespect, and proving doubters wrong. Fans absolutely loved it. Every perceived slight against the franchise instantly strengthened the emotional connection between the team and its rapidly expanding national audience.